Intermittent fasting, which generally entails eating only during certain periods of time during the day or week, has been hailed as a miracle for health, second probably only to people's misguided love for vitamin D. That's the topic of this week's Healthcare Triage. Much like vitamin D, efforts to tell people what the data really say about the effects of intermittent fasting are often defiantly refused. That's probably because a Google search of intermittent fasting and health provides pages and pages of headlines and plenty of scientific sources claiming that it helps people lose weight, decrease inflammation, improve cognition and overall general health, and increase lifespan. Some of that is true in rodents. As often happens, results from mice and rats have been presented as though they apply to humans as well. This is not a reasonable assumption to make, but there have been enough studies to date reporting positive outcomes in animals that a lot of people are sold on the benefits. We, however, are not. But for the same reason we're not sold on those studies, we're also not sold on a recent study claiming the opposite. The people who engage in intermittent fasting by restricting their food intake to a period of less than 8 hours a day had a 91% higher risk of dying from cardiovascular disease. By that measure, you'd think we would have abandoned intermittent fasting pretty quickly. So what's the real story here? To the research. The data have not yet been peer-reviewed and published, but were presented at a scientific conference in March of 2024. According to a report of the data from the American Heart Association, the study analyzed data from over 20,000 people in the United States between 2003 and 2019. Among those adults, individuals who restricted their food intake to a single 8-hour-per-day period were significantly more likely, again, 91%, to die from cardiovascular disease when compared to individuals whose food intake spanned a longer period of time, between 12 and 16 hours per day, which is considered standard. Beyond that, intermittent fasting was not associated with a decreased risk of death from any other cause, and individuals with cancer, whose food intake spanned more than 16 hours per day, seemed to have a lower risk of dying from that cancer. So to recap, this particular schedule of intermittent fasting seems to nearly guarantee early death by cardiovascular disease, and avoiding this pattern of eating will decrease risk of dying of cancer if you have it. Not only are the numbers presented here just silly, but they go against the majority of the popular online beliefs about intermittent fasting and eating and cancer, which only serves to reinforce our point that nutrition data is out of control and to be taken with a grain of salt, particularly as it relates to health. While we currently have no access to the methods or statistics of this study, we can almost guarantee that the 91% increased risk is the relative risk, not the absolute risk. We have an episode on this if you're interested, but essentially the only meaningful information comes from knowing the absolute risk. This number is rarely as eye-catching as the relative risk, though, so it usually gets ignored in favor of getting people riled up. And of course, the usual but very important caveats remain. The study used self-reported data for food intake, which is a very unreliable measure. The study is also reporting an association, meaning we have no reason to believe that specified periods of eating caused any change at all in mortality rates. The people restricting their eating and the people eating all day are very likely to have other characteristics in common, characteristics that would influence both their choice to engage in intermittent fasting and their overall mortality rates or propensity to heart disease. In a nutshell, it could be these other characteristics that increase someone's likelihood to engage in intermittent fasting and the likelihood that they are at high risk of death from cardiovascular disease, leaving no actual relationship between the fasting and cardiovascular disease. Another classic case of correlation not equaling causation, and the drum beats on and on and on. Hey, did you enjoy this episode? You might enjoy this previous episode on misunderstanding the data on diet, exercise, and mortality. We'd appreciate it if you'd like the video right down there and subscribe to the channel, and maybe go to patreon.com/healthcaretriage where you can help support the show, make it bigger and better. We'd like to especially thank our research associates, Joe Sevitz and Edward Lilleholm, and of course, our Surgeon Admiral, Sam.